Now, our next guest is a physician, an author, and a journalist. She regularly provides commentary focusing on Islam, Islamism, and terrorism on multiple TV networks. She's given testimony to the US Congress and given addresses in the British Parliament, the Council of Europe, the Knesset, and many other prestigious locations. In 2010, she became the first physician and the first Muslim woman to be awarded the Templeton Cambridge Fellowship in Journalism. She's received an honorary fellowship from Israel Technion Institute, and she recently came to bear witness to what happened on October the 7th. Take a look at her trip to Israel. Joining us now from New York, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Qanta Ahmed. Uh, Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
And I want to discuss your recent visit to Israel. But before that, what motivated you to come at this time in the first place?
I had an extraordinary opportunity. 5 years ago, I visited the Hamas tunnels at the Gaza border and learned about hybrid warfare from then Deputy Commander of the Gaza Division, Colonel Kobe Vela. And when the attacks happened, I was checking on all of my friends, including Kobe. And after a day or two, he said, would I like to come and see? And for me, I felt that was a pivotal, life-changing decision. I took that very seriously. And my decision was clarified very quickly within about 48 hours in the United States and elsewhere, when the actual reality or the truth of the attacks was already being called into question. And you're familiar that even the Queen of Jordan debated as to whether the atrocities had occurred. And it was the barbarity of that denial which clarified for me that I had to go and see for myself as a non-Israeli, as a non-Jew, as a physician, to be able to tell the world that this is true. I do believe I saw features that would characterize the events as a genocide. And that was what motivated me to be able to go.
So tell us what you saw and experienced in post-October the 7th Israel.
I was able to go immediately. On October 20th, I was in Kibbutz Be'eri. I went also to other kibbutzim nearby. I walked through the homes where murders had occurred, and there was clear evidence of the murders present both in the kitchen, in the dining room, in the safe rooms. It was surreal in the most horrifying way. I was able to see the workers from the Zaka section who handle human remains. I could see young soldiers serving the IDF who'd already been bereaved. I went from there and actually began speaking in that evening, the late afternoon in Kibbutz Be'eri, even to survivors who were coming back to their homes for the first time. I had permission as a lay volunteer from the Shoah Foundation to take video testimony. I did that now, actually just taped the sixth person, adults, elderly, even children telling me about what they had seen and experienced as they were attacked by the Hamas terrorists. And of course, the people speaking to me had survived, but many of their families and communities had lost their lives. I also was able to speak to a very important unit, the 585 unit, the Bedouin Trackers commander and their soldiers, and how they had confronted Hamas in the early hours of October 7th and regained control of important military installations and defended the nation, the state of Israel. It was very important to me as a Muslim to meet the Israeli Bedouins who are also Muslim and recognize that Hamas is an Islamist jihadist lethal threat, and it was their moral duty, not only their military duty, but their moral duty to defend the country against it.
And you've said we shouldn't call October the 7th a massacre, but instead a crime against humanity. Why so?
Well, part of what I was also able to see was to go to the Shura which is the military base by Ramleh, and to see the morgue where initially bodies arrived by the hundreds, and speak to the police workers, speak to the military workers, speak to CSI, very seasoned detectives, walk in the refrigerated containers, look at the remains of human beings that were still waiting identification, and go from there to Abu Kabir and actually inspect the bodies of people that had been murdered by Hamas. And for me, that was critical that I do that personally. I was given full access, not only to where the remains of human bones and human teeth were being carefully studied, but also where bodies were being brought with no identity, and looking at them like a physician with pathologists to understand how the murders had happened. And when you look at these bodies, they have been murdered numerous times in many different modes. That means they've been stabbed, they've been shot, they've been macerated and crushed by vehicles. I personally saw cadavers with the wrists still restrained with zip ties. They're brought in like that because these are murders and they have to be documented and investigated in that manner. And unfortunately, there was not sufficient attention until recently, though Israel has been investigating this from the outset. The crimes against women and girls, the crimes that were committed to the unborn, to me, they speak very much of a serious attempt to eradicate a race based on its identity, and that is the eradication of the Jewish person, the Jewish child, the Jewish elderly, and the Jewish unborn. And I am not a human rights lawyer, but these crimes very much speak to me of genocide. I think it is also explicit in the Hamas charter that they have themselves called for genocide repeatedly. Even since this attack, they have called for further attacks of the same nature. And so I encourage the international community to look at these crimes through that lens and have prosecutors and experts in human rights decide if this truly was genocide. To me, it seems to be. And there is some basis which is also supporting that. I want to bring your audience's attention to a remarkable French attorney, Francois Zimmeret, who is based in Paris, who's already representing, I think, 11 families from Israel who have lost loved ones, and has brought them to the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court to give testimony about what happened to their family. He's already filed a complaint about genocide and filed an international request for an international arrest warrant for the leaders of Hamas that our colleague from the IDF was just speaking about. So this is much more than terrorism from what I can see, though I'm speaking to you as a physician.
And you mentioned the crimes against women and girls. What is your take as to, or your best guess, as to why these crimes were minimized and actually even ignored by organizations like UN Women for so long?
Well, it's inexplicable to me, other than there is some belief that the body of Jewish girls and Jewish women, when they are weaponized for war, when they are exploited in the most base and dehumanizing methods, somehow are accorded a different status, which is completely unacceptable to civilized society. I think that I don't understand it. I'm absolutely proud that my organization, of which I'm a senior fellow, the Independent Women's Forum, issued a press release, wrote to the White House, and made a call for that to be recognized. And we did that on Friday. And we're now seeing the United Nations respond and recognize that these crimes against women and girls have committed. I also think the evidence is so overwhelming, and this additionally adds my concerns about a genocide being perpetrated. Hamas documented in minutiae every crime, murder, every debasement of a human being, an animal, everything they documented, and they came with the intention to document. The intention to document means that you did plan this kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism, this kind of a literal extermination. I was also able to be present at Camp Herzog in the Glilot military base while I was in Israel, seeing the first screening put together to the world's press. We were not able to bring any recording materials in there, but to see the atrocities that Hamas had themselves recorded and celebrated and feted and then disseminated. That kind of dehumanization is designed to further terrorize members of the community that survived or members of the community that might be their next victims. It is an extreme act of violence, extremely intimate methods of killing, which surpass almost anything that we've heard of. And we do know of the Rwanda genocide. We do know of the genocide ISIS perpetrated against the Yazidis. So there's many levels of evidence which would point to the fact that this was much more than a terrorist attack, albeit a very planned one.
And so, having seen that footage, having witnessed the sites of this mass killing, having gone to Abu Kabir to see the Forensic Institute, and then seeing the footage from the scenes in America and indeed other countries, ranging from college campuses to city council meetings where people deny or minimize or even justify what Hamas did. How do you rationalize that?
So first of all, it's an extremely low point for the United States. We seem to have lost all ability to communicate. The protests, I've spent my career in universities, the protests from the universities are extremely disturbing. Our youth, I think, in the United States has been deeply radicalized. This does not mean that I don't have terrible anguish about the civilian loss of life of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children who are not affiliated with Hamas. I think it's devastating. As a Muslim, I feel complicity because the Muslim Arab world has not found itself capable of alleviating the pressure on these innocent people and allowing them to escape the theater of war that Hamas is operating in. And so that's a very difficult scenario for us to see as Muslims, whereas we've seen the fleeing populations from the Ukraine conflict, the fleeing populations from the Syrian war, the fleeing populations from the conflict in Libya. I mean, it's endless. But somehow the Arab Muslim world and the Muslim majority world has decided not to alleviate that human suffering in an obvious way, which would be to move them out of the way from harm without changing territorial relationships on the ground. So we're almost subjecting the Palestinians to take the full brunt of conflict, which is aimed at Hamas, and Hamas is utilizing and exploiting these innocent people. So that's extremely difficult. Coming back to the United States, this event has revealed to me anti-Semitism has become mainstreamed. Anti-Semitism is legitimized, including by Hollywood actresses, some of our most expensive universities, some of our most prestigious institutions, our state, local, and federal politicians are tolerating this. And if there is any silver lining, I am relieved to understand the depth at which this kind of anti-Semitism has taken root, because we must now combat it in very tangible ways. This is not hashtag activism. This is going to require lawsuits and penalties. In the United States, we absolutely protect the right to religious identity, the right to religious freedom for all. And that there cannot be a situation in which Jewish people in the United States are afraid of wearing religious symbols, afraid of going to their places of worship, afraid of being discriminated against. That is absolutely illegal, and we now need to enforce those laws. At the same time, this is a clarion call about the radicalization of our youth, which is completely enmeshed with Islamism. If we just talk about that for a few moments, Michael, Hamas, in their actions on those bodies and on those people that I saw, was expressing violent Islamism. There is no violent Islamism, hostage taking, suicide bombing, mass terror events like 9/11 or the Bataclan. None of that happens without non-violent Islamism. Non-violent Islamism is very established in the United States, the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Part of that glorifies the Muslim as a victim. I'm not a victim in the United States. I have the most privileges I could have had, perhaps even from my original place of birth, Britain, here in the United States, in terms of legal protections, rights, all kinds of opportunities, earning power, and so forth. But the Muslim Brotherhood indoctrinates Muslims to be victims, to create not parallel societies, as I've said before, but closed societies where they're not penetrable, and then they use democracy to exploit privilege in order to tyrannize minorities. That's what we're seeing. Our Jewish minorities in America are in absolute fear. I have met Jewish colleagues, friends, their children who are at risk for showing their religious symbols, at risk for going to places of worship, at risk for revealing that they are Jews. This is a tyranny, and this is being driven by sympathies with Islamism and with the woke left. It is very dangerous for the health of the United States as well as for American citizens. So it's a blessing that we know the threat is so serious, but we must act not merely through social media, but with every means. And maybe that brings us to a final point, which is, why should a Muslim or a non-Jew or a non-Israeli or a Christian become involved? Because if we're going to allow October 7th to occur and be silent, we become complicit. There is no neutral position as a bystander. And if you think one voice doesn't make a difference, one voice can make a tremendous difference, even if it comes at the expense of social exclusion and being rendered a pariah and losing relationships and friendships and perhaps even employment. Somebody needs to speak, because we know when no one speaks, when there's a feeling that entire nations are silent, this gives license to Hamas and similar groups to perpetrate their acts. I remind you, we have not fully eliminated ISIS. ISIS is resurgent in ungoverned areas between Iraq and Syria. This is enlivening all Islamist groups. We've seen this afternoon the news in Paris, where somebody has exacted retribution in an act of jihadism that the Paris authorities are investigating, and a German citizen has lost their life. This is all connected, and each of us has a role to prevent that. And it's quite independent of politics. It's quite independent of standing with Israel. In my opinion, standing with those victims in Kibbutz Be'eri and in other places in the southern Gaza envelope area is standing with humanity. If you're not standing with humanity, you are legitimizing Hamas, and that is completely immoral.
And so what would you say to those people, maybe predominantly young people, who are, making these kind of statements that we've spoken about, and letting them, how would you let them know that the battle against Hamas is relevant to them too, Jewish or not Jewish?
I think it's very difficult to have a dialogue with an individual who's already been indoctrinated. But alongside the indoctrinated are the followers, or those who barely understand Islam, let alone Islamism. There's a huge need to explain who Hamas is without lending it legitimacy or glamour. There is a huge need to explain that when I wrote on, as the war began, Israel's jihad is my jihad, that does not mean Israel is a jihadist. It means Israel's battle against jihadism is the battle every Muslim army. Egypt has fought against this. Pakistan has fought against this. Saudi Arabia has just expunged Islamist ideology from its entire landmass. These are wars that we have been fighting as Muslims for the legitimacy of Islam. And this is another front. This is no different than the women and girls who were enslaved to ISIS. 4,700 women still remain enslaved to ISIS in the Yazidi population. So the event of October 7th needs to be incorporated within the last 25 years, and particularly with the war in ISIS, so that there can be some perspective. And also, it's very important that we protect, even as a believing Muslim, we have no right to prevent another individual from observing their religion. In fact, it's our duty to protect them and allow them to observe their religion. And maybe think not about a geopolitical conflict 8,000 miles from here, but think about, how am I treating my neighbor? How am I treating my co-worker? How am I treating my fellow believer in God who needs to worship on Saturday when I need to worship on Friday? Let's bring it back down to the individuals, but we also need very potent examples from those in power, very clear messages, including, I think, the opportunity to speak to Congress and testify about what I have seen, what the survivors have gone through, what the rescued hostages have seen, to create those opportunities at Senate committees, to create those opportunities in the United Nations, the European Parliament, and the International Criminal Court. This is going to be a massive undertaking that is going to very much outlast the current war that is ongoing at the moment.
Very, very important. Before we wrap up, there will be many, I am sure, that are watching and thinking, how can we ensure there are more voices like Dr. Qanta Ahmed out there? What's your answer to that?
I would say, I think that there are many voices, you know of them, and they have joined you on this platform. I think everything begins with a relationship with what might be considered the other. This concept of otherization, where we have an in-group, and for instance, if one is an Islamist, the Jew is an out-group, Jewry is an out-group, Judaism is an out-group, the state of Israel is out. That is extremely damaging. Break those rules. Go outside of your group. Learn from others. Take a risk, but do so with the right intentions, not to prove a point, not to win an argument, but to truly learn. This is a point of human suffering that we're all experiencing. And there is a real risk that Hamas could glamorize jihadism once again, as we saw ISIS doing. We don't want that. I also think questions should be asked. There are many that are complicit in this, not only Hamas. Where were the raw materials provided for their warfare? Not just missiles from Iran or magazines from Kalashnikovs that I saw from Syria. That's not the only complicity. Where did all of the raw materials come for their tunnels, the concrete, the electrical wiring? How could it be that we're learning, at least reported in the Jerusalem Post, that 2 hostages report being held hostage by those that had been employed by UN agencies? There is a very wide net to cast, tremendous responsibility, hundreds of millions of dollars pouring in annually, 100 million from Iran, I think 120 million from Qatar, going into Gaza. Who has been responsible for the governance and the transparency of the accounting of that money? Who can say that they don't have a role in the terrible destruction and loss of life that we're seeing? Those questions need to be asked by lawyers. Those questions need to be asked by human rights investigators, prosecutors. We need to help them as much as possible. And that starts with critical thinking. And you can do that with your own community, breaking out of groupthink. That's very, very important.
Absolutely. I would encourage our audience to follow Dr. Ahmed all across social media. Dr. Ahmed, we appreciate your voice so much and we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for the wonderful opportunity, Michael.
Thank you so much. A powerful and important voice.